Ramadan.
Warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome back to the program. And of course, it is now time for a Palestine Ramadan radio. And we thank the good folks at the PSA for helping us produce the segment every single day. On the show, we speak to various experts from both South Africa and Palestine about the situation in Palestine, the occupation, as well as, of course, Masjid al-Aqsa, which is very topical. And of course, joining me right now is an individual who needs no introduction to the Salam Media audience. That's Naim Jeenah. Naim Jeenah, of course, as we know, is an expert in the Palestinian Arab, academic specializing in Middle East and political Islam. But of course, today, inshallah, we're going to be talking to him about the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, as well as the Tambo-Dadoo Palestine Legal Fund. Naim Jeenah joins me now. Assalamu alaikum, Naim.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Two very
Jazakallah.
long names, a mouthful, each one of them.
No, I was just telling the audience, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, there's really nobody else in South Africa really that has a grasp of the issues that we talk about, particularly in the Middle East. And for me, it's a great pleasure. And thank you so much for making time, Naim. Naim, before we get into the discussion around the the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, I just want to get your take on recent events in Masjid al-Aqsa, and particularly as we as we go towards the end of Ramadan. We always see every year that conflicts flare up in the occupied territories and in Al-Quds during this time of the year.
Yes, and this year was no different, of course. I mean, let me say first that the Israelis, in fact, we must say, were quite nervous in the run-up to Ramadan, expecting that they would have a challenge in terms of resistance from Palestinians in general. And so even before Ramadan started, around the last week of March, the Israeli repression against Palestinians, particularly in Jerusalem, became quite harsh. A number of Palestinians were killed before Ramadan even started. And we're looking at, I think, just over 20 since that last week of March until now, Palestinians that have been killed. And that then, into Ramadan, of course, I should just say that this notion about, the overlapping of Ramadan and Easter and Passover, etc., really makes no sense. Why there should be greater repression when three holidays overlap. It's Ramadan, and it's a time when the Israelis are particularly repressive. And so we saw that from the beginning of Ramadan, the invasions of Masjid al-Aqsa, and the invasions of Masjid al-Aqsa by the security forces is something that has been going on now for a few years on a daily basis, where Israeli Jews come into the masjid every day. Even though they, in terms of the agreement, the so-called status quo regarding the religious sites in Jerusalem, they shouldn't be. But they come into the masjid every day, and they had threatened that this Ramadan, well, not this Ramadan, that this Passover, they would not only come into the masjid compound, but they would pray there, which is a violation of the agreement around the masjid, and they would sacrifice an animal there. So there was they had announced this, and they had made it clear that they were going to do this. So there was lots of kind of nervousness and tension around that. And then the security forces invaded the masjid, and we saw that footage. Breaking the windows of the masjid, tear gas into the masjid, people getting beaten up for no reason whatsoever, just walking in the compound, etc. Alhamdulillah, it was somewhat different from last year. If you remember, last year in May, the attacks in Quds in Jerusalem resulted in the resistance in Gaza responding, and there was a huge bombing of Gaza that took place as well. That, it seems, this Ramadan has been avoided. But this is where we are. Yes.
Mhm. But Naim, does it not also, highlight the importance of solidarity for the Palestinian or the peoples that have been, occupied, the Palestinians? Because we still see the aggression, we still see the unfair treatment of Palestinians, whether they're Christian or Muslim. We still see the aggression. We still see the absolute bullying of the Palestinian people. And which brings me to my next question: the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network. 21 countries in the Senegalese capital. That's got to be very significant. It happened last month. Tell us about that. And you're also part of the steering committee as well for this particular initiative. But I'm really interested to know more.
Yes, let me just make one point about what you said, because
Mhm.
I missed it out earlier. That, what was clear was the attacks over the past few weeks in Jerusalem were against Palestinians. The masjid was attacked, but so was there an invasion of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre over the
Mm.
Orthodox Easter, and this classic video of this policeman or Israeli policeman or soldier separating Christians who wanted to enter the masjid into Palestinians and foreigners and allowing the foreigners in. So it's not about whether you're a Christian or whether you're a Muslim, it's about whether you're Palestinian or foreigner.
Right.
And many Muslims that go to Masjid al-Aqsa in Ramadan know that this is the case there as well. If you're a foreigner, you get in. But the guy standing next to you who's Palestinian doesn't get in as easily. So I think that this is an important point, and you raised that as well. Around the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, as I say,
Yes.
long name, mouthful, PAPSIN for short. So the network started last year, just about a year ago, last year, May,
Okay.
as an attempt by a number of solidarity organizations on the continent, together with the BDS National Committee in Ramallah, to set up a structure that will bring together solidarity organizations across the continent. The feeling was that there hasn't been coordination in solidarity at all across the continent in different countries,
Okay.
etc. And of course, a month or 2 months, a month after that, was when Moussa Faki accredited Israel to the African Union, giving the network some work to do and a campaign to work on, which they did. And there was a campaign across the continent, a number of countries. There was lobbying with governments. There were statements issued, protests took place, etc. And but this was during the lockdown, of course. And so last month, March 2022, was the first in-person meeting of the network, meeting in Senegal, in Dakar. And the reason we met in Dakar is particularly because the president or the chairperson of the African Union now is Macky Sall, the president of Senegal. And we felt that it was important to meet in his capital and make a point about this action by the African Union. 21
Mhm.
countries, as you say, were represented by the solidarity organizations. A few others, maybe about half a dozen others, who might have been there but were unable to attend. So, say 24 countries or a little more than that. A couple of Palestinian speakers were there. The public event was a one-day conference at which speakers included Zwelivelile Mandela, and Nelson Mandela's grandson, member of
Okay.
parliament, of course, in South Africa. Also, Emma Nyerere, the granddaughter of Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who spoke there, the Palestinian ambassador, and a few others, a couple of Palestinians, etc. That was the public event. The real hard work was done the 2 days before that, which was a strategy meeting of the network, looking at the state of Palestinian solidarity on the continent, the state of Israeli infiltration into our various countries, how that infiltration has happened, what elements were involved there, what have they used, and some of the issues that came out, the use by Israel, the Israeli government and Israeli companies of, for example, agribusiness, agricultural stuff, agribusiness, irrigation, etc., militarization on the continent, which is our kind of catch-all term for things like the sales of weapons to African countries, surveillance equipment, spyware like Pegasus, etc. And what we saw is that many African countries are purchasing a lot of this kind of equipment and weapons, etc., to be used against their own population. The other thing linked to this is elections equipment, which again is often used, and there's one or two cases where people are alleging that it's the Israeli provided election equipment that's been used in vote rigging. Because clearly Israel wants to make sure that they have friendly governments on the continent, etc. A number of other Christian Zionism, for example, was discussed as a big issue on the continent in terms of a challenge for Palestinian solidarity. So these were the kinds of things that were raised and plans put into place about how to address each one of these challenges in a coordinated way across the continent.
Naeem, so many points that you've actually just mentioned in that answer. I just want to hone in on just one or two, if you don't mind. You mentioned the state of Palestinian solidarity on the continent, and you also gave us a few reasons why how the threat to Palestinian solidarity manifests itself when Israel does business dealings and so or sells equipment to African states. But in terms of the solidarity itself, I mean, by ordinary African people, would you say ordinary African people understand, the situation that the Palestinians are undergoing and are supportive of it? Just for example, like they were of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa.
I must admit, kind of embarrassedly, because I travel a lot. I used to before COVID,
Right.
including on the continent, and I meet Africans from southern Africa to North Africa in different forums outside of Africa as well. And when we met in Dakar, I was surprised at the level of Palestinian solidarity that does exist. So I was ashamed that I hadn't understood that before. But in many countries, there's a continuing, ongoing sense that many people have of the kind of history of colonialism on the continent, as well as colonialism in the Palestinian context, the history of the links between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and African people, etc. That exists. It's still there. There are still a good number of people, former political prisoners, etc. Even young people. We had young people there as delegates from
Right.
Cameroon, from Namibia, who feel that this is, a kind of liberation task, decolonial task for young people on the continent. But the challenges are great. I mean, that does exist. But, and the challenges, of course, include, for example, poverty that exists on our continent. It includes the dictatorial regimes that exist on our continent. And people have to fight their own immediate dictators before they can think of others outside of the continent. These are realities that we have to contend with. And when you bring in that religious factor, which Israel uses very effectively. I mean, in Zimbabwe, for example, there was a business person whose task for years was to go up and down between Israel and Zimbabwe just to win over churches in Zimbabwe. And he was so effective that Zimbabwe appointed him about 2 years ago as their honorary consul in Israel. So the use of churches has been quite effective, and this poses a great challenge for Palestinian solidarity on the continent.
Naeem, I just want to also ask you with regards to Africa itself. I mean, we see the Israelis also targeting Africa, almost as if like Africa is the new frontier when it comes to business, when it comes to even China is targeting the African continent. People are talking about could there be another sort of like move towards the colonization of Africa? But that's a different topic for another day. But there's this systemic targeting of the African continent, and we see that the Israelis have also targeted the African Union, and they've got that observer status at the AU, which to some extent is quite embarrassing for the Palestinian cause on the continent. Would you say that there's a concerted effort to win over Africa by the Israelis?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, look, pre-1973, many African states actually had good relations with Israel. There was this, many African states actually believed the propaganda that Zionists taking over Palestine from the British was similar to decolonization on the continent. In 1973, with the war that then took place, and the Organization of African Unity issued a very strong resolution calling on African states to cut ties with Israel. That, right, to a large extent happened. I mean, we were at a point at some stage in the late 70s, early 80s, where you could point only to South Africa and Malawi that had relations with Israel. But Israel has been working since then, both with the political elites in the various countries, as well as with, for example, in what is now called South Sudan, working with the, at that time, Southern Sudanese rebel groups, supplying them weapons, etc. When South Sudan was created recently, Israel was right there, provided the VIP security, all of those kinds of things. So they've been working very hard on the continent for decades, quietly, through their lobbying, through their economic muscle, through their supposed aid. And as came out in our conference last month, much of this aid, for example, the agri-aid, much of it is actually very destructive to local farmers, etc. So they've been providing all of that. I mean, 2 weeks before the African Union heads of state meeting recently, where Israel's status in the African Union was maintained, the now chairperson of the African Union, Macky Sall, 2 weeks before that meeting, signed a $350 million weapons purchase deal with the Israeli company. Okay. So, as I say, in many of these countries, it's ordinary people that suffer because this equipment, spying equipment, etc., is used against their own citizens, not against some foreign country. And then, so yes, Israel's been working extremely hard on the continent in all of these ways, and this, of course, makes the task greater and more difficult.
Absolutely, and speaking about great tasks, there's the Tambo-Dadoo Palestine Legal Fund that's just been launched. Could you tell us about the work that you're going to be doing with this fund, and what does it aim to do?
So the Tambo-Dadoo Palestine Legal Fund started late last year, and kind of in the process of setting up, but it's fashioned on something that existed in the past called the International Defense and Aid Fund, based in London, whose task was firstly to provide legal support and aid for South African political prisoners, and secondly, to set up a network of moral support by families in Europe with families of South African political prisoners at the time. So I'm on the board of the Tambo-Dadoo Palestine Legal Fund, named, of course, after O.R. Tambo and Dr. Yusuf Dadu. And Tambo's son, Dali Tambo, is on the board, as is Roshan Dadu, Dr. Yusuf Dadu's daughter. And the objective is, the focus is mainly on the family part of it. And so what we are doing is we're setting up these connections, linking up South African families with families of Palestinian political prisoners. And you know that Palestinian political prisoners, there's about 4,500 of them. There are 3 political prisoners at the moment, actually, who have been in jail for 40 years. If you thought Nelson Mandela was a long time, 40 years they've been in Israeli prisons. So the idea is that we set up a one-to-one connection between a family of a Palestinian political prisoner and a South African family. We're collecting the details on the Palestinian side with our partners there. And on the South African side, we're building up a database of families that are willing to be involved in this. And it would be a kind of solidarity connection on an ongoing basis, with South African families offering moral support and solidarity to these families in Palestine. It's a kind of project that hasn't happened anywhere in the world. And the idea for us is to start with South African families, and then once it's established, to broaden it out beyond South Africa as well. But right now, we're calling on South African families that want to be involved in this project to contact us and put their names down, and it will effectively start in the next month or so.
Naeem, still on the fund, when we spoke to the the activists in Palestine for the Palestinian political prisoners, some of them are often asked to spend to pay copious amounts of money by the Israeli authorities. Will this Tambo-Dadoo Palestine Legal Fund also help with the raising funds? Because some of these families just simply have no way of coming up with that money, for the that the Israelis are demanding from them. Somebody that's in prison for a very long time, arbitrarily so, are told to spend or to pay these very high fines.
Look, immediately we're not going to be. So I mentioned the IDAF in the past, which did raise funds for legal fees for South African political prisoners. In the Palestinian context, except for political prisoners in the 48 areas within Israel, if we talk about the West Bank and Gaza, for example, there are a number of Palestinian NGOs that deal with political prisoners, that provide legal support, that have lawyers on their payroll, and they fund it. So we're working with some of these NGOs, and the message from them is that immediately that is not necessary. Nor is financial support immediately for the families of political prisoners, because they are supported by the Ministry of Prisoners and Shuhada. So we're not. Obviously, we are, the Tambo-Dadoo Fund is raising money for its own operations, but immediately it's not money that's being raised to provide to those prisoners or their families, because that is being provided for in some way. Yes, it is very difficult for them. Costs are extremely high, but those costs are being mitigated.
Fantastic. Naeem, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I haven't spoken to you in a very long time. I'm looking forward to our further discussions, inshallah. I've learned a lot always from you over the years. May Allah reward you and keep you, inshallah, to continue doing the good work you're doing, inshallah.
Ameen, and for you as well.
Ameen, jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Naeem Jeenah, director at EMEC, of course, talking to us there about Africa's initiative to show solidarity to the Palestinian cause. And of course, this particular organization was launched last year, properly this year in person, the Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, of which he is, is part of the steering committee. Of course, we're going to be keeping tabs on that and finding out a lot more about how Africa, is going to express its solidarity to the Palestinian cause. Bringing our time to just 27 minutes after 5. We're going to take a break. We'll come back with Maulana Yunus Kawanga, and he's going to take us into Iftar in Johannesburg. Stay tuned.